Great. Thank you, Richard. Good morning. Aloha, everybody. Pleased to see you out here when it's a beautiful day outside. I'm hoping to use the next couple of minutes to talk about, as Richard mentioned, this notion of the human values in the architecture of the net and how best to promote and protect them. I used to work in Washington, D.C. for a number of years for Google. So another way to think about this session is, hi, I used to work inside the Beltway, and I'm here to help you. In particular, I'm going to talk about some of my thoughts about how the world's policymakers should look at the internet, how we should conceptualize it as this process, as this thing, as this ongoing creature, almost that's alive in a dynamic sense, when it thinks about some of the tough, thorny public policy issues of the day. So let's just jump right into it. So this is, of course, the way most people think about the internet, right? For most practical purposes, as you all know, the net is becoming what I think of as the chief operating system for all of society. And yet, confusion and misapprehension about how the net functions, its basic design attributes and engineering values, unfortunately remains frighteningly high. I would submit that the net community itself may, at least in part, have itself to blame for this predicament. After all, we urge policymakers to look the other way when talk about internet regulation would arise. Think about the net as a big amorphous cloud, right? We would laugh when a certain US senator would rail about the internet as, quote, a series of tubes, or a certain US president would refer to, quote, the Google. We thought, okay, if they don't really know exactly what's going on there, they'll sort of shy away from imposing laws and regulations and requirements, right? If the simplistic message was just don't regulate the internet. It's become painfully obvious, at least to me, and I think increasingly to many others inside the Beltway, that the days of easy sloganeering are well past us. Ignorance no longer could be considered a crutch for so-called unregulation. It's time for the net community to come out from behind the curtain and explain itself. And what we really need is a public policy paradigm where the basic workings of the net are actually understood and fully accounted for as we do wrestle with some of the more difficult societal concerns of the day. Under this banner, government involvement would happen only for the right reasons, aimed at the right targets, and utilizing the right processes and people. So, what happens when our policymakers fail to act in this manner? Well, a number of you may remember going back to the fall of 2011, the US Congress was considering legislation to deal with the unlawful dissemination of unlawful content. It was the Stop Online Piracy Act, or SOPA, which was a companion measure to the Protect Intellectual Property Act, or PIPA. So SOPA, PIPA was sort of the catchphrase. Both bills were based on the same premise. You impose certain technical requirements on website owners, search engines, ISPs, and other entities in order to block the online dissemination of the unlawful content. Now, at the time, dozens of well-noted network engineers pointed out that the proposed means of filtering the internet's domain name system and other routine naming and routing functions was problematic on at least two scores. First, it could be easily circumvented by people with the right technical know-how. And second, both the tech mandate and the circumventions themselves would adversely affect countless innocent online uses. In other words, the pending legislation suffered from both ineffectiveness, or under-inclusion, and collateral damage, or over-inclusion. It was a bad functional fit to the otherwise laudable goal of minimizing online content piracy. Now, unfortunately, these voices were not heard at a House committee hearing and subsequent markup that was held in late 2011. Instead, members debated among themselves over the efficacy of the bill's approach. For example, one member explained that, quote, I don't know about the technical stuff, but I don't believe the experts because, quote, I'm not a nerd. Others made similar points about supporting a technical solution they did not fully understand. A few voices argued the members should probably not vote out of ignorance, as Congressman Jason Chaffetz put it at the time, quote, maybe we ought to ask some nerds what this thing really does, unquote. Nonetheless, the bill was voted out of committee and made ready for floor vote, and was expected to be signed by the president within the next several months. Many of you, of course, remember what happened next. On January 18th, 2012, which is actually 4 years from yesterday, a host of online companies, including Google, participated in what became known as the Internet Blackout Day. In protest over the two bills, over 115,000 websites committed what was the web's version of a collective work stoppage. Lawmakers received some 14 million email messages from users, and the response was swift. The legislation would not be brought to the floor of either chamber. The nerds, it seems, at least in this case, had won. So why is that not the end of the story? Some of you may remember our former Speaker of the House of Representatives. The problem is that with the Internet blackout day, politics, as usual, won the moment. Frankly, at least from my perspective, this is not a desirable outcome, one that was driven by confusion and even fear rather than understanding. Such shows of political force are usually difficult to replicate, complicated to harness, and can quickly lose their novelty and their impact. Moreover, while it was most impressive and effective, at least for the moment, the show of force convinced politically without convincing intellectually. More to the point, in the context of the SOPA PIPA battle, why did the network engineers care so much about protecting the essential workings of the Internet, and most of the politicians seem to care so little? Perhaps the essential problem boils down to a difference in values. As author Guru Madhara points out, engineers and politicians simply think differently. For example, politics is the art of compromise. Engineering is the science of trade-offs. Engineers prize efficiency, while government was designed to be inefficient. Think about James Madison's checks and balances set up in the US Constitution. An engineer's mind is an inference engine. A politician's mind inherently relies on argumentation. Politicians also love compelling narratives and human interest stories. Engineers typically understand, let's be honest, objects better than people. You probably know the old joke about the introverted engineer who stares down at his own shoes as he's talking to you, while an extroverted engineer will stare at your shoes. In short, as Guru indicates, politics runs on feelings, not on formulas. So clearly the net does not exist in a vacuum. Economic and political reality demands that we broaden our mental models to encompass the power equation of money and politics. As the SOPA PIPA battle amply demonstrates, we need to expressly recognize and accept this larger context within which the net operates, namely the various political and economic systems. As the late Evie Nemeth labeled it some years ago, layers 8 and 9, added onto the famous or infamous 7-layer OSI protocol stack. We too have to include these contextual layers in our mental models of the net. So what about the engineering design principles and values to which I've been alluding? Where do they come from, and why do we ignore them at the Internet's peril? One can point to numerous mileposts in the history of the Internet to chart its origins. For today's purpose, I'd like to go back about 20 years to the mid-1990s to highlight several key events that help us appreciate the functional integrity of the net. Perhaps the seminal happening was very little noted at the time. On October 24th, 1995, the U.S. Federal Networking Council adopted a resolution proposing a definition of this relatively newly commercialized thing known as the Internet. And the Council articulated that the net is comprised of several elements, namely, one, a set of online services riding over layered communications infrastructure, and two, IP and TCP protocols tying together the services and the infrastructure. Or in the parlance of the Internet's modular design, the online services reside in the upper applications and content layers, the physical communications networks reside in the lower infrastructure layers, and the TCP/IP protocols reside in the middle virtual layers. Often known as, of course, the hourglass. Since we're here in Hawaii, hopefully enjoying some Mai Tais even at this early hour, I will employ instead the more festive martini glass to delineate between these three groups of functions, those in the lower layers, middle layers, and upper layers. So interestingly, going back to the mid-90s, you can actually trace the rise and growth of different market segments roughly along those same three sets of modular layers. In fact, persistent and robust ecosystems have formed along those layer boundaries precisely because these different layers help enunciate and enhance, and in some ways limit, the ways that networked entities can interact. On the Internet, form indeed does follow function. You are what you do. So, our first set of examples in the mid-90s, comes from the outward-facing upper layers of apps and content and services, by far the most visible to ordinary users and to policymakers. In Evie's model, this also corresponds to layer 8, which is finance. In 1995, we saw the launch of the Netscape IPO, as well as the commercial introduction of what was then known as Echo Bay and Amazon. Now, for most people, these upper layer activities are, in fact, the Internet. Second example comes from 20 years ago, the lower layers of physical infrastructure. This group of functions is represented at this conference, well represented, by the Telecom Act of 1996, which was signed into law by then President Bill Clinton in the U.S. Library of Congress. This statute opened up the local telephony access markets to competition, created a regulatory mechanism for the bell companies to enter the long-distance market, and it mentioned the internet a grand total of 3 times. So the act has since come to be known for its symptomatic lack of farsightedness about the burgeoning role of the internet. And the statute remains as it was then, regulatory silos in place, ever resistant to the forces of change sweeping the technology and financial worlds. In the Nemeth model, this also can be seen as layer 9 politics. Our third example is actually about the virtual plumbing of the net, which is vastly underappreciated in most quarters, but in fact provides the essential elements that bind it all together. Over the years, organizations like the IETF, ICANN, and IAB have promulgated various logical protocols and standards that keep the internet running. That process may best be epitomized by RFC, Request for Comment 1958, which was released back in June of 1996, which for the first time attempted to come up with some of the key design principles behind the net. Now, the public policy framework I have in mind takes seriously the design attributes that have been built into the net over the years. How and why we got here can help us understand the way the net has been constructed and why politicians have such a difficult time getting it. It's a truism that the internet was born and raised not from the market, but from an unlikely confluence of government and academic and financial forces. Thousands of people contributed over several decades to what eventually became known as the Internet Project, coming from universities, research labs, government agencies, and corporations. Many of them worked on the technical standards that would provide the essential building blocks for the various technologies to follow. The internet actually originated from several different projects, as many of you know, in the late 60s and 70s, all funded and controlled in some manner by national government agencies. However, the early homogeneity of design and top-down control slowly gave way over time to a heterogeneity of design and bottom-up governance. As one network became a network of networks and government control and funding declined, various commercial and non-commercial entities alike stepped into the breach to guide the internet's continuing evolution. Numerous standards bodies like the IETF and W3C became responsible for developing and blessing the technical protocols that run the net. These bodies utilized open processes where any interested person can participate, technical competence is valued, leaders and participants are volunteers, and standards are derived from a combination of engineering judgment and real-world experience, what's become known as rough consensus and running code. In some sense, the nature of a decentralized process followed the nature of a decentralized function. So what makes the net what it is in a technical sense? Going back to RFC 1958, I would submit that there are 4 key design features that have been built into the net over the years, and they roughly follow these questions of the what, where, why, and how functions. The what function is basically modular assembly. The use of layering is the overall structural architecture of the net. The where function, end-to-end, sometimes called smart edges and dumb core, which I think frankly is a bit pejorative and not actually true, but the basic point is that many of the functions can be more completely and correctly implemented at the endpoints of the network. The third piece is the why. Why are we doing this? It's because you want to connect a bunch of disparate networks together, and so that's the rationale of trying to move traffic from point A to point B. And finally, how do we do it? We use agnostic protocols, with the Internet Protocol, of course, being the prime example, the ubiquitous bearer platform indifferent to the networks below and to the applications riding above. Now, I use the term integrity or functional integrity to describe how these design elements all fit together and function cohesively to create the overall experience of the Internet as seen from the end user's perspective. I mentioned earlier values. Engineers employ values. They think about things in those ways. So the 4 design features that I just mentioned were derived through these bottom-up processes, through years of rough consensus, from well-understood engineering principles. The very engineers who actually created and enacted these design principles were driven by a specific set of values. And in fact, if you go back and read many of the RFCs and other technical documents, it is interesting, in some cases surprising, to see how much the values kept kind of coming into the conversation. These features, these values included words like openness, interdependence, flexibility, simplicity, autonomy, non-proprietariness, non-discrimination, voluntary participation, and decentralized control. Now, in turn, these values on the engineering side become the basis for what end users experience when they interact with the internet. These resulting user values include things like an openness to receive, a freedom to create, connectivity to all, and transparency for all. And my colleague Vint Cerf probably has captured it best with the phrase, innovation without permission. So how do these four micro elements of the net's design interact and provide structure from a more